Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name, as always, is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. Happy Friday to you all. We have made it to the end of the week, and this show should be a fantastic one to close the week out. We start off with only the second time in the history of the podcast. I present to you a mock draft of mine that I did and go over most of the picks that I selected in that draft. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Olympic betting landscape because it's getting a little bit more interesting as more and more Americans are getting familiarized with more and more interesting events. Then, for the first time ever in the podcast's history, I will be looking into the player profiles of college football players. Yes, there is fantasy college football, if you did not know, so why not introduce it to this podcast? And to close it out, remember when we did the strength of schedules for certain position groups? We're going to close out today's show with one of those. We go over the biggest losers in terms of strength of schedule in the wide receiver areas. Before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as a whole. We also receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link gsmc.cloud. There's a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters and ultimately the network as a whole. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Any questions, comments, or concerns will be listened to and addressed and answered at the beginning of the next episode as well. Just leave them in the same spot. Without further ado, let's jump right into the last show of the week, and it should be a good one, starting off with the mock draft that I talked about. Very brief in summarizing how it came about. It was an ESPN draft. It's a categories league, 9-round draft, I believe, snake draft format. And I did get the second pick, so I'm very thankful for that. But I think when you hear the names of the players that I drafted, you're going to think about so many different strategies, because I think this team is a solid foundation for strategizing your draft process, to strategize for when you yourselves are making decisions on certain players and certain position groups. When you hear the names, you're going to think a lot about hero running backs we talked about. You're going to hear about picking a tier in terms of quarterbacks. You're also going to hear about some rookies that I really am intrigued by. So without further ado, let's jump right into the mock draft. I'll start with the position that is so integral yet is not necessarily picked as high as other positions, the quarterback position, because it's always controversial. And I believe the format that I took was pick a tier, because I knew that ultimately the Mahomes, the Allens, the Hurtses of the world would not be there in the draft. So I picked up a very serviceable second option, Brock Purdy. And the reason why I love Brock Purdy as a fantasy quarterback is because he's always going to be in a position to put up stats because of his team. I'm not necessarily calling him a system quarterback, and I want to dissuade that notion, even though I'm a Seattle Seahawks fan and I love calling him that. We have to put those grudges aside because Brock Purdy is, at the end of the day, a very solid fantasy option. And then on my bench, I have Jared Goff, of all people. Last year, he was one of my starters on my fantasy team because I told you the story about how I had to stream all of these quarterbacks because I started off with Deshaun Watson and I wanted someone different. And Jared Goff came in. He's a very solid player. He's in a similar mold as Brock Purdy, where he's in an offense that really suits his skill sets very well. And so distributing the ball is not his forte, but he does it in such a way that he can get production in so many different ways. He doesn't necessarily have to rely on, say, his verticality or his running ability, because those are two of his weaknesses. He can rely on the offense around him, much like Brock Purdy. And so I kind of went with this system QB look at my QB position. And then for the running backs, let me tell you the funny story with this. The second overall pick, I completely thought this guy in front of me was going to take Christian McCaffrey, and I would have to settle for Breece Hall as my first running back. But then he selected Breece Hall, so I was like, Christian McCaffrey just fell into my lap. But I'm so glad that he did. Injuries be damned. Christian McCaffrey is always going to be the number one pick in a draft. Don't be like the guy ahead of me and draft Breece Hall, because McCaffrey is the number one guy in this draft. He's so versatile. One of the X factors in that San Francisco offense that really makes it tick. And that through line with him and Brock Purdy, I think would really help me get stats. I don't think they cancel each other out because Brock Purdy has so many weapons. He's not always going to go to McCaffrey, and McCaffrey is a running back at the end of the day. So that through line is really exciting. Then my bench, I told you guys about him, Tyjae Spears. I really love this guy in that Tennessee Titans backfield. Really going to help Will Levis a lot. I can't wait to see him improve consistently as the years progress. He's a work in progress. He has so much raw potential. And I think that this is going to be one of his breakout seasons. Then I have a guy in Jaleel McLaughlin who is kind of underrated in that Denver Broncos backfield. Javonte Williams should get all the headlines, and deservedly so, but Jaleel McLaughlin's a very sneaky player, very explosive, can get you some chunk yardage. Not necessarily a starter or someone who you would immediately plug in should one of your running backs get injured, but he's a nice little bench option that I picked up at the end. Now let's go to the wide receiver position. This was very much getting a superstar and then throwing darts at a board. I picked up Mike Evans, not necessarily the best superstar, but come on, man. He has 10 consecutive 1,000-yard seasons. Had so many different quarterbacks in each of those seasons, and he's not going to be denied. He is the epitome of a solid fantasy wide receiver just because of the stats he puts up. And then behind him, Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp, obviously it's up in the air whether or not he's going to even be the Rams wide receiver one because of the emergence of Puka Nacua last year and because of his injury history. But at the end of the day, when Cooper Kupp is fully healthy, he is, I do believe, a bit more important in the offense than Puka Nacua because both of them are solid route runners. But Cooper Kupp also combines his intelligence and IQ to understand Matthew Stafford. They are very inextricably linked with each other. Where one goes, the other goes. And so I'm really going to be intrigued to see that dynamic work out should Cooper Kupp find himself back in the wide receiver one role. And I forgot to talk about my starting running back, actually. James Cook, I decided to pick up as my starting running back. You guys might be skeptical about this pick. I really like it because James Cook, last year we saw when the Bills went to more of a short passing game, James Cook really popped out and he stood out and really caught a lot of fantasy heads' attention with his play. And I think that as a receiver, he's going to add more value out of the backfield as well. And so I really like that addition. And then at the tight end position, we always talk about going one path and sticking with it. I went with the young path. I went with Trey McBride as my starting tight end. It's a bit of a risk, I know, but I really think that Trey McBride cannot go underestimated or underlooked or undervalued in that Arizona Cardinals offense because at the end of the day, Marvin Harrison Jr. can open up a lot of stuff for other opportunities to arise within that Arizona Cardinals skill position group. And so Trey McBride, especially in the red zone, I think is where he's going to make his bones and get a lot of targets. And that's going to make a lot of fantasy managers happy. And so that's why I decided to take the flyer on Trey McBride. And then my bench, first of the rookies that I picked, Brock Bowers. A little bit of a risky pick here because Brock Bowers is in a weird situation where his QB is not going to be consistent. But I think he's going to be a starter. And I think a lot of people are going to really value him as he progresses as a player in this league because he can do a lot of different things. And should the Raiders improve over many different seasons, I really think Brock Bowers has a chance to be one of, if not the best tight ends in the league over the past couple decades. Next couple decades. And then another rookie that I wanted to point out on my bench was Xavier Legette. Xavier Legette is definitely getting overlooked in terms of rookie wide receivers. That's just how deep this class was. And when I think about Xavier Legette and how he fits into that Carolina Panthers system, he's definitely someone that's going to add a lot of verticality for Bryce Young. He has a very high catch radius as well. And I really like young receivers who can combine that speed and catch radius because you don't get many of them in this league. And so expect Xavier Legette to get a lot of nice yardage off the bench for you there. And then, in terms of my flex option, I really, really love this pick as my flex option. Tank Dell. I think that the Texans wide receiver room, as deep as it is, definitely needs kind of that secondary option outside of the big guns in who you expect in Stephon Diggs and Nico Collins. And Tank Dell, last year at least, before he got injured, was that guy. I think he sets the bar as the wide receiver 2 for the Houston Texans and really adds a lot of variety in the red zone for what they can do. And he really opens up a lot of spaces. I also picked up Terry McLaurin. We're going to have to see how he performs with Jaden Daniels under center. But Terry McLaurin is always a sneaky fantasy guy. Always in the reckoning for a lot of 1,000-yard seasons. And so, really like that pickup. And then, let's talk about the defense. Because defenses are very important because they can swing some games when you're in close ones. And the Browns' defense certainly can do that. Browns' defense is basically like a really good wide receiver just because of the stats they can put up based on how they perform on the field. The Browns' defense is ultimately like your sixth man or something like that. They are a unit that you can really trust at the defensive spot. There are so many different units now that you can trust at the defensive spot, but at the end of the day, the Browns one is the cream of the crop. You're not going to get much better than that. When I look at this draft, yeah, I see a lot of strat. I see a lot of hero running backs, a lot of running backs in this team. McCaffrey and Cook, Spears, McLaughlin. But I also see like a very measured, balanced team, and that's what I love about doing fantasy. Finding balance in your squad so that it doesn't necessarily get too bogged down and loaded down with a lot of top heaviness. I think that you need balance in your squad to succeed, and that's what I think my squad achieves. That will just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we switch over to the Olympics. Let's talk a little bit about them and the betting landscape that has arisen, especially in America, as more and more people become attuned to certain events. We'll be right back after the break to talk about that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign.